Is it possible to hotbox ramen? Welcome to this month's episode of Will It Cook, where I'll be trying to see if I can wirelessly cook ramen. And by wirelessly, I just mean by not allowing the noodles to touch any boiling water. I'll be using Nongshim's chicken flavor. It's the only flavor I had 3 packets of because I will be cooking ramen in 3 different ways today. The first way is by your typical classical boiled ramen. The second is more of a barometer just to make sure that my hypothesis of cooking ramen using steam only is even remotely possible. And the third is to see if I can use a steamer for clothes to cook ramen. I went ahead and pulled all of the soup-based packets out of the bags just so I didn't accidentally forget about them, and then struggled for a few seconds to get the ramen back into the bag that I had pulled it out of. But after all of that, I was on my way. We'll of course start out with our control group, the ramen that was simply boiled in water. Nothing special, just boiling water. Considering that if steamed ramen worked, there wouldn't be any liquid water to add the soup-based packets to, so I decided that I would drain the boiled ramen once it was done, and I wouldn't be adding the packet until after doing so. For the second group, which I guess would either be a positive or a vehicular control for any of you science nerds out there, I boiled a bunch of water and put an oil splash guard meant for frying food over the top, just to allow the ramen somewhere to sit while steam seeped through it. I then added a glass bowl on top of it, which you might be thinking is for heat retention, but I'll explain why I did this a little bit later on. Third and finally would come the fun part, where I set up a few cups to hold the ramen a few inches off the counter so that my steamer could sit underneath it. This is just a reminder that I am aware of how dumb some of these ideas are, but that's the fun part. As I turned on the steamer, I realized that I was going to have to either sit down holding down the steam button, or I could just figure out a way to tie it down. I couldn't find my tape at first, so I decided to use 2mm 100% natural cotton fiber cotton twine and butcher's twine to tie it down, which took me a second to figure out how I was going to make that work, but eventually I got it to work. This obviously isn't the intended use of a steamer, so I don't recommend doing this, and I had the necessary safety precautions out and prepped, just if necessary. Another problem I started running into was that I couldn't get the steamer to point straight up since it had a rounded back. So I had to jerry-rig it a bit with some tape and the cups, just at least until it was good enough for government work. I didn't get this much on video, but I still basically had to sit there the entire time and hold it down just to make sure that there was as much steam as possible getting onto the ramen. But as you can see, we were cooking literally, and now it was just a waiting game. My steamer is also very loud, so there are a few different headaches starting pretty early on. So in order to just explain why I think this might work, a package of dried ramen is basically just a big blob of really tightly packed starch and gluten and some other stuff. And in order to cook and become soft like we like, water basically needs to enter these little pockets of starch at really high temperatures, like 60 to 80 Celsius, which causes them to swell and start to break apart. This allows all of those proteins to become a little bit more flexible and move in the way that we like them to. However, as a gas, meaning water vapor, water is extremely less dense and spread out, meaning that it's significantly harder to get enough water trapped into those noodles, into those little starch pockets, to allow them to cook in the way that we're wanting. So the problem I had to fix wasn't necessarily a heat problem, it was a water problem. The heat is there, but the amount of water we need isn't once it's converted to water vapor. This is why I added a glass bowl over the top of the ramen to hopefully at least saturate the air a bit more with water vapor to at least increase the chances of this happening. As you can imagine, the boiled ramen cooked pretty quickly relative to the other two, So I went ahead and just decided to give it a taste test while it was warm, since I had no earthly clue how long the steam would take. As I mentioned earlier, my plan was to drain the water out of the boiled ramen and just add the soup base to the noodles themselves to at least be able to compare the steamed ramen to the boiled ramen. Not ideal as far as taste is concerned in my book because I love soup, but I needed to do it. I added roughly half of each soup base to the noodles, and considering I wasn't adding them to water, I didn't want to be overwhelmed by the spices, which would distract me from the noodles themselves. So obviously, as you can see, we have quite the extravaganza here. I only added roughly half of the packet just to see. I didn't want to overwhelm it with too much of the soup base. So I added half of each of the packets that it came with. I'm gonna give this a quick taste test first. Yeah, half the packet is a perfect amount. Enough to where it's still a little bit spicy, but still tastes good. So that's gonna be the base. It tastes like ramen. It's great. Naengshim is one of my favorites, so no complaints. Texture is perfect. I ate pretty much the entire bowl then and there. I realized I was pretty hungry, but the problem child was looming nearby. Not only was the steamer pretty loud, but it also stopped working after about an hour. No matter what I did, how long of a break I gave the steamer, what setting I pushed, it didn't matter. I just couldn't get the steamer to produce steam anymore. So I gave up on my steamer and started looking for other options. I had forgotten about my DJI camera that I had just gotten recently that I could throw into the setup. So while I was swapping over, or at least trying to figure out the problems with my steamer, I threw that on just so we could get, I guess, like an action shot of ramen. I don't know. Luckily, my neighbor had a steamer, which was actually significantly easier to set up and was producing quite a bit more steam than mine was. So although I knew that this probably wouldn't work in the first place, I actually had maybe 2% of hope that it might. New steamer system set up, but unfortunately this one's a lot louder. And it's gonna be a lot more annoying, but we'll see if it works. So now it was just a waiting game between my two steam systems, but since it had already been about 2 hours at this point with the ramen on the steamer in total, I wanted to check to see how it was doing just to see if it was even worth it to continue. Well, there's like one little corner up here that's maybe gotten a little bit cooked. I'm gonna assume that's just because it was submerged with water the most, but outside of that, it is... You'd be surprised, it's not rock hard if I break it right in front of the mic. It's not like a big crunch, but definitely not cooked. I had a decision to make at this point, and just doing some basic math in my head, this pretty quickly became a pretty big fail. I couldn't generate enough steam from the steamer to actually cook the ramen, so I'll have to come back and try again. But let me know if you have any other ideas in the comments. So now it was time to focus on the ramen sitting above the pot of boiling water.
Lord.
And I was immediately surprised at how much warmer the glass was. I had a really hard time figuring out just how to get the bowl off the ramen.
All right. It's squishy.
To my surprise, it was actually starting to soften after having been sitting above the boiling water for roughly 2 hours. You'll even be able to see whenever I flip it over right here that part of it actually looks cooked. I let it sit over the water for another hour or so and checked on it again.
No way. That's, dare I say, cooked. It's hard to tell because it's still attached to the other noodles, but like there's cooked noodles in here.
I started spreading out the noodles just so that they would cook a little bit better, but once I flip it over, you'll really see how much these noodles were really starting to cook. This had been roughly 3-ish hours at this point, so it's definitely not an efficient process, but I was incredibly surprised at the progress. Since my clothes steamer hadn't worked, I was starting to lose my patience for this, but seeing how well this was working was basically renewing my interest in sticking this one out.
All right, we are now on hour 4. Just looking at it, I can tell it's dried out a little bit. We'll get a look. Moment of truth. Doesn't look horrible, only partially like brains. Very sticky.
At this point, it was like midnight, and I had gone through probably 2 gallons of boiled water in that pot. So the writing was on the wall, and this just wasn't going to get much better anytime soon. As you can see, the noodles on the outside cooked surprisingly well, but the noodles on the inside were still that dark, uncooked color and texture, almost as if they had just been taken out of the package.
So just stirring it around, there's definitely noodles that are fully cooked, as you can see. Like there's a big color difference. All of those noodles that got stuck in the middle, I don't think they ever had a chance of cooking. And I tried to expose them at about the 2.5 hour mark, but it looks like this is just gonna take 7 to 8 hours of boiling water in order to make work, which I just don't have the patience or time to do. But even the parts that aren't fully cooked, they actually don't look that bad. They look almost like a fried noodle, if that makes sense. So it's not just like a tough, uncooked noodle. They feel fine. This is gonna taste fine, I'm sure. It's kind of hard to mess up ramen, but obviously it just doesn't seem like the texture is gonna be nearly at all what you're looking for whenever you cook ramen. All right, it's been close to 4.5 hours since I started cooking this ramen. So obviously cooking ramen wirelessly, if you wanna say it that way, or cooking ramen with steam, not a great idea. I actually still have the ramen from my steamer. So I mean, I'm gonna go ahead and just give this a little. I guess I'm kneeling now. This ramen's obviously not cooked. It's not cooked at all. I will admit that I used to eat raw ramen whenever I was younger, just as a snack. And it's definitely not that tough or hard like a cracker. It's a little bit soft, but it's basically just like a stale cracker. That's how I word it. It sucked. I don't really know how to word it outside of that.
This is also where we'll take our quick pause for our patented tofu sniff test.
But I have found a bite that I think I can, okay, there we go. I think this is gonna be the closest to just a normally cooked ramen that I'm gonna be able to get. It's a little deceptive. I'm gonna equate it a little bit to the salmon that I cooked in my dishwasher, in that I think just the alternating temperature has just made it completely cook unevenly. It's like the outside of the noodle tastes perfectly fine, but then as you go through it, it's basically just like it's al dente, kind of uncooked on the middle. It's not quite uncooked in the middle, but it's definitely not like a cooked noodle like you'd want in your ramen. And quite honestly, I kind of wish it was less cooked. That way it was at least like a little bit crunchy or something like that. Because right now it's just kind of like a weird mushy texture, but it's not bad. I'm gonna give it I'm actually gonna give it like a 6 out of 10 on taste, a 3 out of 10 on texture, and like a 1 out of 10 on fun. This started off being fun, but this dragged on for like 3 hours longer than I was hoping it would. So I'm at this point just ready to get this over with. But it's not bad. Like I quite honestly, I think I would finish the whole bowl. This is probably the worst ramen I've ever eaten in my life. But like I said earlier, it's ramen. It's really hard to mess up ramen. It's still good. I would still eat it.
So with that being said, I'll be giving the steamed ramen the esteemed label of being edible, but realistically that's not a very high standard, and like I mentioned a second ago, a lot of that is probably just because it's hard to mess up ramen. But the noodles did partially cook, especially way more than I thought they would. So this is a victory, albeit a moral victory, in my eyes. With that being said, let me know if you have any ideas on how I can improve this experiment, cook that steamed ramen a little bit better, and subscribe if you're interested in seeing some of the other stupid stuff that I do.